Why do we have a fuller house than usual, I wonder? My guest tonight, here's something that was once said of him. John Barber, the London critic, said, "A young Welsh boy jumped on the back of this play as if it were a fiery charger and rode it to triumph." They don't write like that anymore. The play was Shakespeare's King Henry IV, Part 1. And Barber went on to say that this man made Prince Hal noble without arrogance, graceful without effeminacy, handsome without dullness. I don't think I could have described him better myself. He's also known for his bedrock honesty, his very Welshness, his magnetic personality, his blazing talent. On the rare occasion if he misses a performance, it is headline news around the world. You know who it must be, don't you? Has anyone guessed yet? Ladies and gentlemen, will you welcome then one of the magnificent figures in the English-speaking theater, Mr. Richard Burton. Here we are.
May I say thank you very much for your encouragement. And that's the first time I've ever heard that notice. I know John Barber, yes, but I never read my own notices. That sounded rather good. I should have read it.
Well, actually, I made it up. No, I guess whoever he is, only he could write that well. You know, I was checking you over to see if you were wearing any red. I read, R-A-D, that there's a superstition involving red. Is it too private to reveal?
No, not at all. I believe that...
Oh, no.
When I was... Also, there's red on the tie.
Well, there's a little on the tie, but this is much more dramatic, I must say.
Also, I got red underpants on, but I'm sure you wouldn't see them.
How many would... Well, never mind. Can't let the audience run the show for us. I don't think I can go on now. I've never had this happen. I can't take my eyes off. Those are very lovely.
Very elegant. Also, I got very, very beautiful feet.
Yes?
And very dainty ankles, if you notice.
Never had any complaints?
Never any complaints, yes.
And they're paisley socks for those who want to go out and get some just like them. I don't know why that reminds me, but I had a dream about this show, or these shows, that it was a collector's item, I think. It's, do you want to hear it? It's, maybe are you good at analyzing things like this? You came on in my dream, sat down, did not remove your shoes, and without saying a word, you erected a card table here, and then another, and then another. As in that act in the circus when a clown gets on a stack of tables and sways. You insisted that I get atop this pile of card tables and do the show from there.
Yes, now how to analyze that? I would think very quickly that quite clearly it represented in your mind my career. A delicate balance. There's no knowing when the whole cardboard structure would collapse. And you were hoping that it would not.
Why would it be your career, not mine? I've been atop a few card tables. But...
Well, I think that your reputation as an entertainer, as an interviewer, whatever it is steadier than mine as an actor.
I see. Well, it's very good of you to put
Thank you.
yourself into the precarious position there. Well, if I feel the table slipping at all, I'll certainly be glad to let you know. People around the country are going to get to, in more than New York, are going to get to see you in Camelot. And I think everybody must know that you did it before. So in a lot of ways you would think it must have been easier this time, and you can think of obvious ways in which it would be, but is there any way in which going back to it was tough or harder than you expected?
Yes, it's a little harder, I think, the second time round, despite the fact that one's technique, etc., there's a much more massive body of technique behind the performance than there was 20 years ago. But one of the most difficult things about the present production is that in the early part of the show, I have to make the audience believe that I'm vulnerable and that I'm not arrogant, and that is very difficult because I played so many kings and princes. I've assumed a kind of almost regal arrogance every time I go on the stage, and that is the most difficult part of the show for me. The first section of the show, which lasts about perhaps 28 minutes, and it takes me, for a time, I get very little response from the audience. They don't laugh at the laugh lines, and then gradually they accept me and forget who I am, I hope, and then it turns into a perfectly normal audience.
Is there any particular technique you use for getting that sense of vulnerability? Do you know what
Well, I stutter a little. I don't know. Well, you've seen the show and you've seen what I do. I'm not quite sure how I do it, or if indeed I do it. Yeah. Did you think I did it?
Yes, I did. I don't know. Well, certainly. I'd be a fool to say no, wouldn't I?
Well, no, you could say, no, Richard, your natural arrogance came bursting through despite your Orlando costume. That's the most difficult thing, I think, to do.
Yeah. And if all else fails, you can always kick off your shoes and...
yes.
Feel sorry for your socks or whatever.
No, actually, I was, as I said to your production manager, I said I very rarely watch talk shows, but when I do, I'm very conscious of people's shoes because they always cross their legs like this. So let's try that.
That's right. It seems to be a rule.
And the shoes are always in front of the people, and I become so fascinated by the shoes that I forget to look at the faces. So I thought I'd try with my socks.
That's right.
But maybe they're attracting more attention now. Do you think? Then
I don't know. I like the idea that talk shows
do that. Makes a difference.
I just thought of someone tuning in 5 minutes from now and wondering, saying, he really is on the skids. The guy has
Maybe you should explain every so often why.
Tough all over. Every 5 minutes to remind me to point. You're right, you do feel like you have to cross your legs on a talk show, and it does. They have become more shoe business than show business. Well,
very good.
If I could get away with that.
I remember that.
Would you believe we didn't plan any of this stuff backstage? Are all Welshmen able to sing like a lark? It seems to be a national trait, and...
no, they don't all sing like larks, but I know there was a famous Welshman, for instance, who was famous for his music, actually, a man called Ivan Novello, whose full name is Ivan Novello Davis, and he was a Welshman. He couldn't sing a note, but he wrote those musicals that went on forever and ever, you know. It was, I've forgotten what they were called now, but The Dancing Years, and I think he wrote Keep the Home Fires Burning and stuff like that, but he couldn't sing a note. And I remember his telling me once that he did a tour of hospitals during the war, and a piano was, and he played his famous numbers, and in one ward they asked him to sing, and he said, I can't sing, and they refused to believe him. And there was a lady who accompanied him on the tour. She was Welsh too, and he said, Daphne, you sing. And she said, I can't sing either. So they tried to sing, and I didn't believe him. And I said, well, sing for me now. And he said, well, what do you want me to sing? And I said, well, sing the minstrel boy to the war hath gone, or something. And he sang, and it really was the most extraordinary cacophony, I believe the word is. And it really was the minstrel boy to the war has gone. I mean, he couldn't do it at all, and I don't understand that.
Well, he ended up in the musical world. It's
very strange, yes. So he could pick out a tune, but he was tone deaf.
I thought the green valleys of Wales always rang with the natural voices of the...
Oh, yes, for the most part, I think we sing rather better than most people. I don't know whether it's the coal dust in the air or the eternal rain.
Yeah.
But certainly most Welsh people sing mellifluously.
Yeah. How do you say what looks like Pontrhydyfen?
Pontrhydyfen. Pontrhydyfen.
Pontrhydyfen.
Means the bridge. We have a lot of Latin in our language. It means the bridge across the vale or the valley.
Yeah.
And there is a bridge that crosses my village from mountain to mountain.
And that's the village you were born in?
Yes.
Yeah. I don't know why. I had an image of your childhood as being upper class somehow, and been to Oxford, and undoubtedly was to the manor born, if that's the right use of that. And it was anything but that. I wonder how many other people are under the same mistaken...
No, I had a very happy childhood. We were pretty poor.
Yeah.
It was during the Depression. My father was a miner, and all my brothers except one, my younger brother, were miners. And they all got out of the mines, except the very oldest one, who loved the mines so much that I couldn't bribe him out. I couldn't get him. There was no way I could get him out. And he stayed in until the bitter end. So that he died. He died last year. No, he died this year, actually, about 5 or 6 months ago. And you can imagine how tough the constitution of the family is, that with his lungs full of dust, he lived until he was 79. And he was very angry because he didn't make 80. Oh. But to have lived that long and to have worked, he went down the mines when he was 13 years old, and he came up when he was 65.
And he died of the lung ailment from...
Yes, pneumoconiosis.
Yeah. You weren't being sarcastic when you said he loved the mines.
You really, you really...
I didn't know anyone loved to...
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. My father, who was apparently a great miner, is in the days before mechanization and so on, when you got the great seam, there's a great seam, a famous seam, a world-famous one, which I believe is called the Great Atlantic Fault. And it starts in northern Spain, in the Basque country, and it goes under the Bay of Biscay, and it comes up in South Wales, and it goes under the Atlantic, and comes up in Pennsylvania. So that if you took a Basque miner or a Welsh miner or a Pennsylvania miner, and if you could blindfold them and transport them, and they know the coal face the minute they saw it, I believe it's 4 feet 6 inches. And my father used to talk about it as some men will talk about women, talk about the beauty of this coal face. And my brothers would tell me stories about my father, who would look at the seam. My father's a very short man, an ideal height for a miner. He was about 5 feet 3 or 4, very, very powerful, of course. And he would look at the seam of coal, and he would, as to almost surgically, make a mark on it, and then ask his boy. Every miner has a boy who works for him, and he would say, "Give me the number 2 mandrel." That's a half-headed pick. And then, having stared at this gorgeous display of black, shining ribbon of coal, he would then hit it with one enormous blow. And if he hit it right, something like 20 tons of coal would fall out from the coal face.
Really?
So that it was thrilling, it was exciting. And indeed, that's why I think when you perhaps think of me as being born with a silver spoon and so on, miners believed themselves anyway, to be the aristocrats of the working class. They felt superior to all other kinds of manual laborers. They were skilled workers. That coalface was a magical creature.
Has that all been replaced now by mechanized?
Yes, you could drill things now and you
lost some
cut
of the
out
romance.
lumps of years.
So your father would probably be against that.
Yeah, well, he wouldn't say that. He'd say they're not miners at all now. They're just...
machines do the work.
Machines do the work, yes.
Yeah. Did you have a fear of the mines? What I'm trying to say is, did you see yourself as that was something to escape, to get out into another world?
No, not at all, no. The opposite, as a matter of fact. Everybody's ambition, every little boy's ambition in my valley was to become a miner, because there was the arrogant strut of the lords of the coalface. They had these muscular buttocks and the bow legs, and they walked with a kind of arrogance, and everybody wanted to be like a miner. Wanted to stand on street corners and look at the posh people pass with hostile eyes, and insult the girls from the doctor's daughter, the lawyer's daughter, the preacher's daughter as they passed, and insult them with these cold looks because they were the kings of the underworld.
They look down on people from below, in a sense, didn't they?
Absolutely. You are clever.
Oh, yes.
You invert things so beautifully.
You'll notice that more and more as we go along.
How many days is this show going to last? Because my feet are starting to get cold. Can I put my boots back on?
Yes, you can, in fact. And for those who've just joined us, he has shoes with him, and you put them on at any time. I don't want you to take cold, as we say in Midwestern America. Does one take cold in your part
yes,
of the
one
world?
does.
One
yes.
takes cold.
One draws a bath.
Yeah.
One takes a cold. Some of those things need a great deal of explanation, don't they? How does one draw a bath?
Why does one draw a bath? You pull it out of the...
I draw you a bath.
Do you take after your father, do you think?
Yes, in many ways, yes.
If I met him, would I see you in some ways?
Yes, apart from the accent, we look very much alike. And especially the older I get, the more like him I look. I'm much taller than he was, of course, and that's about... when I was younger, too, I was much more muscular. And also we both had, to put it mildly, a predilection for strong liquor. And I suppose he died of it, but it took 83 years to knock him off. He was a remarkable fella in many ways. He spoke perfect English and on occasions pretended that he couldn't.
As opposed to Welsh, you mean?
As opposed to our native tongue, which is Welsh. And, well, I remember when he was 79, when he was, do you mind if I tell you a short story about him?
No, like it.
When he was 40 years old, he got into a terrible fight with a chap called Jeremiah John. And this bridge that I told you that spans the valley, the fight took place at one end of the bridge. And anyway, in the course of the fight, my father was, no, he was 40 years old. He was knocked over this sort of piping, and he fell from the end of the bridge, that side of the valley, shall we say. And though it wasn't a straight fall, it was a really precipitous slope, and it was 85 feet. And he didn't break a bone or anything like that. Like all drunks, they're very lucky in that way. But he was in pretty bad shape, apparently. Well, when he was 79 years old, almost 40 years later, I went home. By this time, I'd earned a little money, and so I was pretty flush. I'd made my first film in Hollywood and so on, and everybody thought I was a multi-millionaire, but I went home, and I went immediately to see my father, and I took him to the pub. And we had drinks, and he said, "What's that you're ordering?" And I said, "It's an American drink." I said, "It's called a Boilermaker." He said, "What's that?" And I said, "Well, usually it's a rye, which we don't have in this country, and except we were speaking in Welsh, of course." And I said, "You chase it with a beer." "Oh," but I said, in Britain I do it with rum." "Oh, good idea," he said. So he had a rum, and then he chased it with a pint of beer, and then he had another, and we had about 3 together. And then I had to leave and go and I have an enormous family, so I had to go around and visit. So I left my father and gave him a £5 note. My brother said, "Don't give him money," but anyway, I left him. Couldn't. So he paid off all the debts that he had. And a £5 note in those days was a considerable amount of money. And anyway, dissolved. And in the middle of the night, I was staying with one of my sisters. In the middle of the night, there was a thunderous knocking on the door. And it was with no telephones at home in those days. And it was the local policeman. And he said that my father was in hospital in a place called Burton, and he was asking for me and from one of my brothers called Ivor, as you would say. So I got into my car and I drove like mad. It was about 1 o'clock in the morning. Drove like mad to pick up my brother, who was staying with another sister. And we tore off to the hospital. And there was a lady doctor and a man doctor. And we went to the emergency thing. And they came out and they said, "Does anyone here speak Welsh?" And my brother and I said, we speak Welsh. They said, "Because we've got a man in here who doesn't speak English." So I said, "Okay, we'll come in and translate for you." So we went in, and my father was lying there, and I suddenly realized how little he was. You know, he'd shrunk with age. And he was virtually naked lying there. And he had a bruise on his stomach that was as big as a rugby football. You know, it was enormous, like a pregnant woman. And otherwise, nothing broken. And he was singing quietly to himself. And he'd fallen off the other end of the bridge. It's true.
At 79, he'd managed
At 79, he'd
to fall
fallen off the other end of the bridge, and he landed on what we call a golven. A golven is a dead tree which has grown out of stonework, and it had grown out of this ancient bridge that crosses the valley. And he'd fallen and impaled himself, I mean, on his stomach, on the tree, and he couldn't get off. He was very drunk, and it was a wild night, fortunately, because one of the miners coming home from work heard this singing. And he decided to take a shortcut up the side of the mountain rather than round by the road because the night was so wild. And fortunately he did. And he heard this singing, and he went to the source of the song, and he found my father. And he couldn't get him off. Miner, strong as he was, he couldn't get him off either. So he ran up, and he got down nephews and stuff. And they finally got him off the thing, and he was happy as a lark. So anyway, there he was in hospital. And the lady doctor, who was English, said, "Would you ask him if he knows who you are?" I'd explained that he was my father. So I said, I always called him Dick. I said, "Dick, ti Napoli? Do you know me?" And then in flawless English he said, "Only too bloody well."
It's a shame he didn't live to 120. He could have gone off the center of the bridge. And
well, that's what he said, as a matter of fact. He said, yes, he said, "Well, I've been off one side of the bridge when I was 40. I'm off the other side of the bridge when I'm 79. All I need to do is to go off the middle of the bridge, and I shall ascend to heaven in a shower of angels."
Sorry, I didn't know him. When you were doing his voice just then, it reminded me of my grandfather, who came from Carmarthen.
Oh, yes. Yes.
And there was that slight trill on the R's.
Yes.
And he always said, "Well, if I ever."
Yes.
And got it,
Yes, it's a very attractive accent. I think those who speak Welsh and English, the ones who are monoglot English, the accent is a little sharp and I think rather unattractive. But the bilingual Welshmen, when they speak English, the accent is very...
It's lovely to listen to.
Yes.
But what did he make of your profession? It's so different from his.
He was very, very puzzled. I remember going home once, and I went to the house where he was staying. He used to change. My mother had been dead since I was 2, so he lived with one sister for, shall we say, 6 months or a year, and then he'd move and go to another sister and so on. So I went to the particular sister he was staying with, and I said, "Le Maver," which is Welsh for "where is he?" And she said, "Letin meddwl," which means "where do you think?" So I said, "Thank you," and went to the pub. And there he was indeed. And he was wearing a pair of Woolworths glasses, you know, the kind you go in and you try on it, you get a pair of, which had lost one lens and one thing, and it was tied behind his ear with a string. and he was reading the newspaper, and he squinted at me because by this time, I've been so many years in the mines, he had astigmatism of the eyes from coal dust, and he peered at me because he has 7 sons, you know, and he said, "Pwy un ti," which means, "Which one are you?" And I said, "I'm rich." "Oh, yes, yes, yes." And he said, "I've been reading in the papers here that you're getting $50,000 for 12 weeks' work in that Hollywell." And I said, he said, "That's not true, is it?" I said, "No." He said, "Oh, I thought it wasn't." I said, "It's $150,000. He stared at me as well as he could through those stigmatized eyes and said, "What for?"
It's a good question, isn't it? Yeah, even you were stuck for an answer to that, I suppose.
Yes, well, I couldn't explain. I still can't explain.
How can you?
I still don't understand what happened to me.
Yeah.
It's a remarkable
Still
business.
seems...
I mean, I came into it by accident, and I still think everybody's insane when they pay me so much money for doing what we all do at home.
Yeah. I wonder if that's true of almost all actors who get the enormous financial success, that it seems like some kind of dream, and therefore, because it does seem like a dream, it could also just evaporate and suddenly be...
Oh, yes, I think that one of the actor's nightmares is the fact that one of these days somebody's going to find out.
Mm-hmm. He's going to catch you.
And catch me.
You probably couldn't help noticing that 30-second sign. It's hard to believe that we've come to the end of this portion.
Does it mean it's over now?
Well, only this part.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Oh, it says good night on that.
Yes, often I can't think of the word, and so they have good night there, and then there's another card with my name on it, which I hope is in case.
And mine.
And yours, yes. I usually don't have trouble with the guest name, but my own stumps me sometimes. Mr. Burton, we'll see you tomorrow night, shod or unshod. I think this has been a pleasure. It's just flown by. We'll see you then, both of us. Good night. The red light. There you are. Good evening. I think I'll save some time by not going into a long introduction of my guest. If you don't know him on sight, then you obviously just arrived from some other planet. He was here last night in stocking feet, and it'll take too long to explain that. But to say that he's a splendid actor is to understate the case, and if you don't believe it, you can check that out these days in Camelot, if you're lucky enough to be in one of the cities that it tours in. Would you welcome again what I wish were a month-long conversation with Richard Burton? Last night you were talking about your father, and it was wonderful. And in passing, you mentioned that your mother died when you were 2. When your mother dies at that age, do you have any visual memory of her, or any kind of memory at all of?
No, none at all.
Oh.
And apparently, I was a real mother's boy. I went with her everywhere. I hung on to her. But there must have been. I think the shock must have been so great that when they told me she'd gone away and she wouldn't come back, which I don't remember being told, I never asked for her again. I completely, obviously, cut her out of my 2-year-old mind, and I have no recollection of her whatsoever.
I often wonder if under deep hypnosis, which can regress people practically to the womb, that memories of that age would come out. Supposedly they do. I don't know whether it's dangerous or not.
Yes, it must be sleeping there somewhere in some dormant part of the brain, but I'm not sure that I'd like to remember.
Were you sort of passed about then amongst sisters and the other parts of your large family?
No. My mother died giving birth to her 13th child, and who is very much alive, my brother Graham. And he was 5 days old when she died, and she died actually of neglect. She was a very strong woman, because she was 44 when she died, and she married my father when she was 16, and she had 13 children. And 2 died in infancy, and the others grew up.
Medical neglect?
Yes, she died of puerperal fever, which we used to call bed fever, which is simple neglect by a doctor, hygienic neglect. And so my eldest brother was married, and so my little brother, my 5-day-old brother, went to live with the eldest brother, and I went to live with my eldest sister. But I commuted as to her. She lived in another village called Taibach, and she was married to a miner. And I would spend the school week as to her, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, with my sister in the village of Taibach. And the weekends, or most weekends, back in Pontrydyfen with my family, with my brothers and sisters.
So in that sense, you shuttled...
Shuttled back and forth, yes.
Was her name Sissy, the sister?
We called her Sis, yes. Her name was Cecilia,
something.
yes, actually. Yeah. But she's still very much alive. And her husband, who was like my adopted father in a sense, he died last year from the same disease as my brother, pneumoconiosis. And he also was 79. And I had a very happy childhood. As a matter of fact, I often think when I talk to other people and hear about their trials and tribulations with their parents and so on, that perhaps it's better to grow up without any, to be brought up avuncularly, or whatever the word is, to have aunts and uncles who spoil you and all compete to get your affection and your love. So I would wander around from family to family, and this one would slip me sixpence and another one threepence and so on, and I'd grade them accordingly. And, so I had a really very happy childhood.
Were you above telling one that the other one had given you more? And
I would hint at it, yes. Yeah. I was, as one would do to one producer.
Later Burton was pre-shadowed.
Yes, he had his... as a matter of fact, I'd always had this happy knack of acquiring money, even during the bad days of the Depression. I would sometimes earn as much as the minimum wage of a miner while I was at school. It meant a very full day, of course. I would get up when the miners went to work, or rather when they got up, before they went to work, which would be 4:30 or 5 in the morning. I still do get up at that time. And I would go up to the mountains with I remember I had a green sweater, especially for the occasion. And I'd go up to the mountains with a sack and a shovel and fill up the sack with horse manure and cow manure and take it back home. Then I would have to take a bath, of course, cold bath. We didn't have any heat because I was stinking. And, and put this dreaded green sweater away. And then I would go and wait for the express from London and wait for the daily newspapers to arrive. And then I delivered the newspapers. And then I would have breakfast. Then I would walk to school, the grammar school. And then I had an arrangement with the fish and chip shop and with my customers who had the newspapers. I would sell the dung for sixpence a bucket to the various allotments. You know, people had allotments where they had their own gardens. I got sixpence a bucket for the dung, and I was paid 1 shilling a week for delivering the newspapers, which in those days, I don't know what that would be in American money, I suppose about 25 cents. And then I would recollect some, not all, but a great many of the newspapers which I delivered during the week. I would recollect them on a Saturday and deliver them to a fish and chip shop. and on Saturday morning.
They wrap them in that, don't they, to sell them?
They used to, yes.
Yeah.
Not now. And they don't taste as good, you know, that without the printer's ink on them. I'm
can
sure,
tell.
I swear, I can tell the difference. Anyway, then I would, there was a thing that you turned with a handle which cleaned the potatoes in this fish and chip shop. And, but it couldn't get the eyes out. So I would eye the potatoes. And on a good week, with tips from my customers and so on, I could earn as much as 30 or 35 shillings, which was a miner's minimum wage at that time. And so I always had a happy genius for getting money.
You realize what you've just done. You've given some critic a wonderful
Excuse.
dart. Yes, and now he can say, Burton revealed that he sold dung as a child, and now he's at it again.
Yes, indeed. I think they've one or two of them have said that without
without knowing,
without previous knowledge. Yes.
So, I read somewhere that your first role, R-O-L-E, was
What other spelling is
the
there?
kinds of role, R-O-L-L, I suppose, as in roll in the hay. I suppose
yes,
that's what the dirty-minded laugh was about in the audience.
The first roll, yes.
First,
we'll assume it's R-O-L-E.
roll with the thing over the O. Was silent. That you, some production you were.
Oh yes, it was. That was as an amateur.
School
you
or
mean?
so- yeah.
Yes. I was about 14 and a half, I suppose. And I played the bishop's candlesticks. And do you know that play at all?
Oh, no, I thought that was the part.
No, I've never been very good at playing candlesticks. Candlestick holders, yes, but...
Well, that's easy.
But anyway, it was called the Bishop's Candlesticks, and I played an escaped prisoner or something. I've really forgotten. And the whole thing was silent. And I won a prize, I remember. I don't know why I was doing it, actually, because I wasn't interested in acting at all. I suppose I was talked into it by somebody. I still am.
Still talked into it.
Still talked into it.
Can you remember, most actors can, I find, remember the time when they first felt that sense of power of being up on an elevated platform and having a command when they spoke of people seated below and out front and looking up admiringly, and that sometimes that moment is enough to commit them for a lifetime of thesping.
I don't remember that, but I do remember being... it's a very complicated story, so I'll make it very short. When I was about 16, I acquired an entrance, a sort of exhibition, to go to Oxford University. But I got it too young. I was a year too young before going up. So one obviously had to do something for that year because nobody had too much money. And I thought, well, now I'll go down the mines for a year. And then this incredibly unique, I think, advertisement appeared in the newspapers. It could only have happened in wartime, which said that Emlyn Williams was looking for a young man of 22 who could speak Welsh and who could act. And in the meantime, I'd been sort of made a ward of chancery by a man called Philip Burton, who's had a profound and lasting influence on my life. And I deeply love this man. He's still very much alive. He lives in Key West. And he's become an American.
So we didn't mention that you were born Richard Jenkins.
Yes, I was born Richard Jenkins. And so I knew a great deal about the theatre. It had rubbed off on me from Philip Burton, who was a theatrical maniac, still is. Still gives lectures on the classics and so on, and is indeed one of the most knowledgeable men I know about Shakespeare particularly, and about that whole Elizabethan period. Anyway, so I knew something about the theatre, but I'd never acted except in that Bishop's Candlesticks and one other play, the name of which I've forgotten. So anyway, I thought, well, I'm big enough to be 22. And so Phil Burton and myself said, well, we'll have a go and see if I can get this part. So I got the part, went up to Cardiff, and I met Mr. Williams. And anyway, I got the part. And it was a nothing part. I mean, I hardly spoke at all, but I was on the stage all the time. And it took place in a pub. And I was the pub owner's son. And I was the potboy. You know, I served drinks to people all through the play. And I had one short speech in which I tried to explain to my little brother, who was the real star of the show, the story of Jekyll and Hyde, but very haltingly and with a very thick Welsh accent. And anyway, the newspapers, I wasn't terribly aware of critics or anything in those days, and the newspapers came out and they all said, well, they hardly mentioned me. Or some would say, like, Richard Burton contributed effectively to the atmosphere or something like that. But it was, or they ignored me completely. So I wasn't at all upset because I wasn't all that keen about acting. I thought it was quite interesting that people were willing to pay me £10 a week, which was 3 times more than the miner got. But the New Statesman, I believe it was, which is a weekly political magazine with a high reputation, had a critic for a time called James Redfern, who was a rather fine minor poet. And this particular notice said that the play was awful, and the acting was indifferent, and the direction was awful, everything was awful. I mean, he really was vicious about the whole thing. And the very last line said, however, this is the only notice I can really remember, except 2 other bad ones. However, in a wretched part, Master Richard Burton, you know, in England they call little boys master, which offended me deeply to be called master. Master Richard Burton showed remarkable ability. And I thought, what's he mean? Remarkable ability, all I do is serve drinks. And I speak about Jekyll and Hyde, and rather lamely at that. And that's when the bug hit, I think. Because I kept on thinking, what does he mean? And I'm still saying, what did he mean?
I wish I could help you. I can assure you it's there.
But the sense of power that you talk about, I think, was after I went up to Oxford, and I did a play at Oxford to get out of going to lectures, really. And I did my first Shakespeare, which was Measure for Measure. I played Angela. And then I went off to the RAF, and I was in the RAF for 3 years and a bit. And then I came out of the RAF, and more or less...
Did you say in the bit?
And a bit.
Oh, 3 years and a bit, yeah.
3 years and a little time. He's very slow, you know. Famous for his speed, but he's very slow.
I'll shut up now.
So anyway, again, the same thing happened. I wrote to my old professor at Oxford, and who's still alive, and asked him when I could come back. And he said, don't come back for 2 years, because I know there are 2 things you want to do. You want to get a first, which you probably will, or you might, or something like that. And he said, you want to get a blue for playing rugby for Oxford.
A first is a very high academic
That's the highest
mark
you get, yes. Yeah. There are double firsts occasionally, and very, very rarely triple firsts, but a first is pretty good. And indeed, that was my ambition. It was to get a first and to play rugby for Oxford and get a blue. And he said that the pile-up of veterans who came out of the armed forces before I did, because I was so much younger, was so great that Oxford now had one of the greatest rugby teams in the world, and I had no chance of getting into the team. So I should wait 2 years until they'd all gone back to New Zealand and South Africa and the United States and everywhere. Then I'd get into the team. So in the meantime, I thought, well, I'll try that acting lark again. So I just walked into this Globe Theatre and asked if I could see the big boss, who was a man called Hugh Beaumont, known far and wide as Binky Beaumont. And I said, do you remember me? We met at Oxford and all that. And he gave me a contract for £10 a week. And I did, my first play was with Paul Schofield. And I played his best friend in a play by Terence Rattigan called Adventure Story. And I had quite an important part. Schofield was very much the star, but I had the second, yes, about the second part. And I was fired after 3 days. And they all, I must say, nobody's been fired more beautifully. Terence Rattigan wrote me a long letter saying how sorry he was. and Peter Glenville, the director, the similar, and the producer, who was Binky Beaumont, said that the reason was that I was far too pretty.
Pretty?
Pretty, yes. I have a good look.
Yeah.
I was too pretty to play the part. It would give it overtones of homosexuality if I played Hephaestion, the part was. So, however, I didn't believe them for a second, of course. But immediately I got a part with John Gielgud in a play called The Lady's Not for Burning, which was a huge success. And oddly enough, despite the fact that now I'm famous for my chiefly famous for my voice, which I don't think extraordinary at all, but other people do. It was practically a silent part, and the part that people chiefly remember is my scrubbing the stage. I scrubbed the stage all the way in total silence. From me, I mean. There was a big scene that went on between John Gielgud and Pamela Brown, and that miming of the scrubbing of the stage, like the next day, I awoke, like Byron says, to find myself famous. And I still couldn't understand what the devil they were talking about. And so then Gielgud very kindly took me out of the play, because I could, you know, it ran for forever. He took me out of the play after about 6 months and put on a play himself for me, in which I played my first starring role, which was another Christopher Fry play, which was called The Boy with the Cart. And at the end of the play, beautiful little play. At the end of the play, I had to explain. I played a saint. Have another good look. At the end of the play, I had to describe how this strange man came and put up the king post of a church. I'd been told by God. He's a Saxon saint, Cuthman, Saint Cuthman. I'd been told by God to erect, to take my mother in a barrow and wheel her all over England till God told me where to stop and build a church. And so I wheeled this delicious leading lady I had called Mary Gerald, a tiny, fragile wisp of a lady. And I wheeled her all over the stage. We had this little mountain on the stage until finally we stopped. And there I built the church with the villagers, all mimed, of course. And I'm left alone on the stage, and suddenly the king post goes into place. You don't see it, there's no building. The audience has to imagine it, and I have to imagine it. And then the villagers come back on, and they stare in wonder at the fact that the church is built, it's finished. And they say to me, "What happened, Cuthman, what happened?" And I said, "Well, this man appeared." Well, a sort of man. He was carved out of sunlight. And he put the king post in place. And I could feel the absolute stillness of the audience. And the long-gone atavistic hairs on the back of my spine rose. I thought, what an extraordinary feeling. That was the first time I felt that sense of, actually it was Christopher Fry who did it, not me. I was merely the medium through which the words went. But nevertheless, it was an eerie feeling.
And that's when you were possessed by
That's when
acting.
I thought I'd go on with it, yes.
Yeah. It's a good thing you did. I'm glad you didn't get in a dead of a play at that point and decided to go back to the mines or whatever. Does it seem to you that there's an excessive amount of comparing one actor with another? When Olivier does something, they'll talk about Gielgud's this and that, and your Titus and Olivier's Titus Andronicus and that kind of thing. They're beeping now into later, of course. I often wonder if that introduces a feeling of competition always. Are you always aware of Olivier and Gielgud looking over your shoulder when you do a role?
Well, not so much Olivier, because I realized at once, I saw him in the film, I realized at once that we were very similar in type. We have the same sort of features. The planes of our face are vaguely alike. And I don't mean that we look alike, really, but we have the same sort of shape and weight and size and so on. Also, I realized that my voice was very near, in its natural way, to Olivier's, except mine was, his is much more a silver trumpet, mine is a sort of baritone. And so I deliberately avoided seeing him. Though I did see him, I saw him in two plays in my whole life. One was The Entertainer of John Osborne's, and the other was a play called Semi-Detached by I don't know who. And I saw about half an hour of Beckett, which he did here on Broadway, and I was playing across the street, and on the opening night they went up much earlier than we did, so I popped over to see him. So I deliberately avoided watching Larry Olivier, who was a very great friend, in case I was over-influenced by him. So, but I deliberately watched Gielgud, because we were so different that there was no possible way that Gielgud could influence my speaking of verse or my movement or anything, because we were so totally different. And I learned an enormous amount from him. I believe Gielgud to be the finest verse speaker in the world. And when he does it at its very, when he's at his very best, it's that hair-raising job again, all over again.
He was here the other day, and he in fact recalled the scrubbing scene, and said that even with your back to the audience, you had some sense, some power, or whatever that mysterious thing is, and recalled that scene. But it's interesting that you've consciously deprived yourself, in a way, of seeing what many people call, if not the greatest actor.
Well, I wasn't really aware of it, but Ken Tynan, you know who Ken Tynan is.
Yeah,
Ken Tynan is writing a profile for the New Yorker of Laurence Olivier. And so he came to me he knew that I was a friend of Olivier's, and he came to me to interview me about Olivier, and I said, are you sure that you got Larry's permission and so on? And he said he did, and I saw Larry later, and I don't think he really did have it, but anyway, I was very cagey. But it was only when Ken, who's also a friend, asked me how much influence Olivier had on me, that before going to see Ken, I thought, I said to my wife, Susan, what am I going to say to Ken about Larry? Because I don't want to tell, you know, scatological stories or anything like that, if indeed there are any. So
sounds like there are.
Anyway, and so I was sitting there before meeting Tynan for dinner, and I said, you know, I've only seen Larry in 2 plays. Never seen him play Shakespeare, never seen. And that was, I was really surprised myself that I'd seen him so little. Of course, you must understand that I've been a tax exile from Great Britain for the last 23 years, which also accounts for the fact that I haven't seen him. Yes. I've lived in Switzerland for 23 years.
Gee. Well, do you avoid his films for the same reason, or do you feel not vulnerable to the influence?
Well, I don't watch films anyway, and so that was no deprivation.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Can a bad review still get to you?
I think so. Even a good one can.
Yeah.
For instance, the recent play that happened, I haven't read any notices about myself.
That's a rule, is it?
Yes. I don't make a fetish of it, but I'd rather not know. Good or bad, I'd rather not know. Because if they're good, as I always say, they're not good enough. Yeah. And if they're bad, they upset you. Yeah. And, however, when Camelot opened here in New York a month ago, whatever it was, Susan said that the notices are very good, particularly for you. And she said, and the Times is a sort of rave. And she kept on sort of shoving it around, hoping that I would read it. But I resolutely refused to read it, or to read anything.
I hope she hid the one from you that said that you seem to own the stage as if by birthright.
Oh, God.
I don't see how you could ever go on stage again after.
No, but let me tell you what happened. Susan was calling her mother and father on the telephone, and she said, you'd better leave the room and go into the other bedroom, because I'm going to read the notices out to them. And so I went 2 rooms away, sat there with my little book, and I'm afraid I heard about 4 lines of the Times notice. And it was marvelous. And the man says, and when he says the word
Isn't it lucky that we're going to have to finish this story tomorrow night?
You mean we've been at it all that time? Stop talking.
It's amazing. And I have laryngitis. I don't understand. We'll get right to this. Okay. Richard Burton and friend. We'll see you then. The last time I was speaking with Richard Burton, he talked about the early time in his life when he realized that he was somehow destined to act, but didn't realize, and still doesn't today, exactly what it is, or what the power is, or the gift, or the charisma, or whatever that people pointed out to him that he had at a very early age. He certainly hasn't lost any of it, and it has grown with the years, and I'm glad that he's growing old with us here nightly, it seems, and sharing with us a lot of wonderful information about himself and his life. If you'll welcome again, just to make him feel at home, Richard Burton. Well, let's get to the thing that I really want to know about. What does Garbo's knee feel like?
Absolutely marvelous.
Somehow I expected that. Is anyone in the dark about what we're talking about?
How did you know about that?
What am I talking about, and have I spoiled the punchline of
No, not a bit.
an anecdote, I wonder?
No, you must have read somewhere that I went to a party in Hollywood, is that right?
Yes? Something.
Years ago, I went to a party in Hollywood, and it was, there were about 20 people there. And there was this lady, sort of 40 years old, I thought, perhaps, which seemed to me then to be like 100, because I was only about 25 or 6 or something. And, but I found it absolutely fascinating. And I told her some, what I thought were funny stories, and she thought were funny too. And she told me some. And they were, to my surprise, because she looked so very much like a lady. They were faintly, slightly blue. Wow. And I remember at one point sort of doing that to her. So anyway, I then went to my wife, Sybil, and I said, I've just met the most fascinating woman. I said, that lady over there. She said, that is Greta Garbo. I said, oh my God. I'd never seen her. You see, I'd never seen her in my life.
You mean you looked at that face and did not... Where did you grow up, in a mine?
Yeah.
I can't believe...
I'd never seen her in my life.
Not seen the Garbo face on the screen. No. One of the few people who saw it in life first.
Yes. So that the force that she has on the screen is real in real life, because there was something incredibly attractive about the woman. Because why did I pick her out of this party? She wasn't my age or anything like that. She has it. Quietly blazed, if there's such a paradox as possible.
Does that mean that to this day you have never seen Camille or Queen Christina? Or...
Oh yes, I've seen her since. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I think she is marvelous, especially as a comedian.
You do something that I've tried several times and found impossible. Well, there might be any number of things, but and that is to keep a diary. What is the secret of that? I found it impossibly hard. The discipline, for one thing, and also to not look back and find that the fact that I got up at a certain time and that it rained today is not very interesting years later.
No, indeed, they're virtually unreadable, I think, most of it. I have occasionally had a glance back, but in actual fact, I haven't or only very sporadically, written the diary for the last 3 or 4 years. And I said to a great friend of mine, he said, how's the journal? Because occasionally I take bits from the journal and elaborate on them, and they get published. You know, Ladies' Home Journal or Vogue magazine, or the people who pay the most money. And
Well,
well, Cosmopolitan and stuff. But very rarely. I've only published about 10 pieces in my life. But I said, why, I said to this man whose name is David, I said, why, David, do you think that the impulse to write has temporarily, I hope, just died? And he said, it's perfectly obvious. You're too happy. I thought, but I've been happy before, and I kept on writing, and I still can't work it out. Anyway, it does continue occasionally.
you apparently are a born writer. I read a couple of those pieces. One you wrote about rugby. I won't make you tell that whole story that you've done in interviews, and at least in the one I read in the paper. But you seem to be a writer.
Well, I think, yes, I think I've always admired writers more than any other craftsman. I don't know many painters. I know a couple, I suppose. I find them inarticulate. And actors generally are raconteurs. They very rarely talk about. They tell endless stories, which I'm being guilty of on this program. But I'm capable, actually, of a normal conversation, I hope. But I find the company of writers to be highly stimulating. Very few of them, of course, are articulate in the actor's sense of the word, with the exception of Brendan Byrne and Dylan Thomas, both of whom I knew quite well, who were marvelous talkers. They're generally very taciturn.
Often very disappointing. You think this can't be the person who turned out this wonderful.
Yes, and there's one thing I must say that I always find rather disconcerting. I wish novelists would not put their pictures on the back of books, because you read a book which is perhaps absolutely fascinating, and it's, shall we say, one of these espionage books or something like that, and you read the book and you're absolutely gripped by it. And then there's a picture of the chap on the back, and he's a febrile old man, bald as a banana, about 75 years old, and you know that it's all kind of wishful thinking on his part. He's pretending to be James Bond. Very few faces match up to the writing. I mean, Ian Fleming's dead. Ian Fleming could very easily have been James Bond. But
could he?
Very few. I mean, in looks.
In looks.
But very few really stand up to their photographs, if you know what I mean.
That is interesting. Yes, and you form a picture of the author as you read always.
Yes.
I heard that Ian Fleming was a dreadful man.
I never met him, so I know nothing
Just
about
an
him.
awful man. I forget who wrote that about him. A long piece about Ian Fleming and how it was no accident that the villains were always Jewish or had Jewish overtones, and that he was a bigoted, anti-Semitic, rotten little man.
Yes. I
hope he isn't watching.
He is
from anywhere.
Up there or down
well,
there.
yeah, I hope he is. If he's, where would he be watching from if he's all those things? In Hollywood, you also knew Bogey, as those of us who never met him always call him. And he's one of a handful of people that I'm really terribly sorry I never met. Should I be sorry?
Oh yes, you missed a great personality, I think. Yeah. I was deeply fond of him. He swelled a very, very thin company of people that I know who were absolutely dead on at pricking the bubble of pomposity in other people. He was absolutely extraordinary. He went straight for the weakness in the
seen
pompous.
this thing?
Oh, I've seen it work with him so many times. Yeah. Sometimes, I remember there was a lawyer in Hollywood who was very much a ladies' man, with a great mouthful of teeth, very handsome, and always very tanned, and beautiful hair and everything. And he escorted all the between marriages stars everywhere. And Bogey and I went to this party. I called him Humphrey. I did too.
I will too from now on.
Yes. No, I make it a point that if I really love somebody or respect somebody, I call them by their full names.
It is a kind of affectionate way. Yeah.
Yes, so I called him Humphrey, as I call you Dick, of course.
Richard being my full.
Is Richard actually your name?
Mm-hmm.
Ah, then I shall call you Richard.
Okay.
But, so he said, there was a dance, they'd put up a marquee tent and all that. And so Bogey and I just sat, as we are sitting indeed, and this fella was dancing with various ladies, and obviously chatting them up, as they say in England. And Bogey said, I'm the only man in the world who cannot do an impersonation of Bogey. Bogey said, let's just stare at him, the two of us. Okay. So that's all we did. There was those awful, baleful eyes of Bogey, and he's drinking, what was he drinking? Brandy and Benedictine, I can remember, and he's sipping away. And neither of us took our eyes off this guy. And he danced around the floor, and we never, wherever he went, just looked at him. And finally, you could see the fella fall apart. And he left and went and sat quietly in the corner.
Why he felt the need to do that? Bogart.
He just picked out that
stand.
man and realized, what sort of chap he was.
And knew just what would throw him.
Yes. Yeah. And he was totally unflappable. What's the American for unflappable? I mean,
unflappable is what we've learned to say.
Couldn't phase him, as they say. Yeah. Because once I went to a party at the Bogart's house, and Humphrey was in Africa, I think, making a film with John Huston. I think The African Queen, but I'm not entirely certain. I think it may have been that film they made in Sicily or southern Italy, but with Peter Lorre and all that. But whatever it was, he wasn't there.
Beat the Devil, maybe.
Beat the Devil, it might have been.
Yeah.
And I had dinner with Betty Bogart, as she was then known, Betty Bacall, Lauren Bacall, and my wife, Sybil, and Emlyn Williams, the Welsh actor and playwright and wit, and perhaps 20 other people. And I became absolutely paralyzed with drink, absolutely fractured. And I finally passed out, and they put me on a settee and abandoned me. So Emlyn went home with Sybil, and I was left. The party finally disintegrated, and I left there, and I woke in the morning, and I never suffered from hangovers. And my first hangover when I was 45, I'd never had a hangover in my life, so I felt perfectly all right. But standing there was one of the biggest gossips in Hollywood, and there I was at, shall we say, 9:30 in the morning, Bogey being in Sicily or Africa, Betty being upstairs. And there I was. What was I doing there? Right. So naturally the word spread round from this lady, and the columns picked it up. And I said, you better write. When I heard about it, I said to Lauren Bacall, you better write to Bogey and explain, that I did it again or something like that. No, don't say that, I said. So anyway, dissolve, as they say in the business, and I was in London, and Humphrey Bogart had come back from wherever he was, and they were all staying at the Dorchester, and Lauren Bacall was there as well, and John Huston was directing the picture, and so I went to meet Bogey, and Lauren Bacall, who can be very wicked, said, get into his pajamas. So she got his pajamas out, and I got into Bogey's pajamas, and I was sitting there, as I am here, drinking a scotch on the rocks, and Bogey came home from work, and he passed me, he said, hi, kid. Went into the next room. I felt such a fool. He hadn't said anything about it. Then in came Houston. And I'd never met Houston. And he came shambling in, you know, like the strange bear walk he has. And Betty said, "This is Richard Burton, and it's John Houston." And he said, "Hi, Dick." And I said, "Don't call me Dick, please. Call me Richard." He said, "Sure, Dick." And he's called me Dick ever since. And he also sat down and buried himself in the Paris Tribune or something, and was drinking. Bogey came back in and had a joke has never fallen flatter in all its life. And finally I had to say, "Bogey, I'm wearing your pajamas." He said, "Oh, so you are, kid. Take them off." But
so you've been the victim as well as the...
yes, but he was terribly kind, you know, underneath that hedgehog, bristling personality was a very kind man. And he came with Betty and a couple of other people, I've forgotten who, to Stratford-upon-Avon when I was known. I was making my name as to in England, but nobody had heard of me in the United States. And Bogey came up to Stratford and saw me play in Henry IV, Part 1, and Henry V. And so that when I arrived in Hollywood, he'd already spread the word that I was, you know, coming and that I was a good actor and all that stuff. He was very generous in that way. But I do remember we used to have most enjoyable sort of mock quarrels, and especially about acting. And he said that we British were lousy actors, that all we could do was we were elocutionists and all that. And I said that his type of actor, you are merely behaviorists. You behave, you don't act. You just walk on and be yourselves. And all that, terrible quarrels. And finally Bogey would say, this happened perhaps 2 or 3 times, Bogey would say, "Hang on a minute, kid." And he'd go into the next room and come back with his Oscar and stick it on the table, and he'd say, "Argue with that."
Yes, I am sorry now that I didn't meet him. It's something I read about you and him. It said he had an expression, gas station attendant, for certain people. And
yeah, he said that if you went onto the stage of, on any stage, I've forgotten which studio, he said, Warner Brothers or Columbia or something, he said, "Fill her up. 20 leading men would reach for a hose." But he could be very cruel too, like a lot of.
That I also have read.
Yes,
that sometimes those puncturings were quite brutal, if not almost fatal.
Yeah, there were times when I was almost constrained to belt him in the mouth, but there was no stopping him. Sometimes he just went on and on. Yeah. But I do miss him terribly, and Hollywood will never be the same without him. And also, I have a man who was very kind to me in Hollywood and was a screen idol. And still is, Spencer Tracy. And so when they both died, going back to Hollywood was like, for me, like, it's this way to the tomb. Mm-hmm. And it's never been the same since. I still enjoy it. Yeah. I still enjoy Beverly Hills and all those places.
I guess, though, you've named 2 of the most missed people. I can remember Peter Lorre once on an old talk show, not of mine, it was Jacques Parr's, getting almost tearful about Bogart and saying, "I still miss him every day." Yeah. And it was a very nice and quiet moment and very moving. Tracy made it look like anybody could act. I know several people have mistakenly gone into the business or whatever, thinking that
yes.
All it takes is to get out there and just be natural and say it like real life, and that's all there is to it.
Oh, the tremendous effort, the tremendous art that went into that, deliberately hiding from the audience any technique whatsoever, so that it seemed that he was there by accident. I went to watch him work once at MGM, and he was doing a film called The Actress, I think it was called, with Gene Simmons. Mm-hmm. And I'd read the script, and he had a very long speech about poverty and the bitterness that poverty makes in people and so on. And it was a really eloquent piece of writing. and the actor's gums as to ached to get my teeth onto the speech. And I wanted to see how Spencer Tracy would do it. And so I sat there, and there was Gene Simmons and Gene Simmons' mother in the film, and Spence played her father. And he started munching a piece of bread, I think it was, as the speech started. And he spoke the speech chewing all the time. One time he left the room, and so a good third of the speech he wasn't on screen, and he walked back into the room still chewing. And it was devastating. Devastating.
That was the final version. That's how he did it.
I
That
think,
was not just an
I don't know,
exercise.
I never saw the film, but that's what I saw. It was extraordinary, because it's the exact opposite of what I thought he would do with it.
Do you think he always had that? Is it something he learned? Suppose if you saw early Tracy, you would see mannered, stiff acting?
No, I saw, through Catherine Hepburn's good graces, I saw a lot of his early films, like Fury, which was a very fine film. I don't know if you remember it, where, you know, he's a lynch mob burns down a jail, and he's in there. Tracy's in there, and there are cameras taking pictures of this burning of the jail, and everybody thinks he's been killed, burned to death. But in actual fact, he's alive. And then you come in, you don't know, the audience doesn't know that he's alive. And then suddenly there's a man sitting at a table like this, and the camera is on this head, and he lifted his head, and it was Tracy. And the look on his face, and before that he'd been a happy-go-lucky, jolly fella driving across country to meet his girlfriend. The look on his face was so unbelievably terrifying. The bitterness, because of what they tried to do to this innocent, happy-go-lucky, most happy fella. It was extraordinary. Yeah, it's worth seeing.
See.
But I'm not a film buff, so I'm not very good.
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
Do you ever feel there's a proverb to beware of what you wish for because you might get it, or there are various versions of that, I guess in almost every language. And I suppose there have been times in your life, viewed from the outside, where it seemed you must have everything that anybody could want, and people would be saying, well, I wish I had his problem, I'd love to, all of that.
Yes,
have you, in fact, or I'm not sure what I want to know about that. Or, what does it feel like to be in that position? Do you ever fear that the gods will envy you in the Greek sense in times like that?
You're talking about hubris and
I suppose, yeah,
overweening pride and
all that stuff. Yeah.
Well, I think I've tried to avoid it. It was very difficult sometimes, especially when you're very young.
Yeah.
But all the time, if there's the slightest suggestion that I'm going to feel smug about my career, about my work, or whatever, when I've been particularly successful, you know, life goes in cycles, and sometimes you're on top of that cycle, and everything you touch turns to gold, and then you can't do anything right. And when I'm very much on top, then I think of the very fine actors that I know. I ran into one in London recently who hadn't had a job for 14 years, and yet he played very strong supporting parts of the Old Vic when I was there. And I think of him and people like him. There are thousands. Yeah. And thank the gods that I'm at least not in that position, and at the same time feel for them so that I don't get too cocky and believe that I'm some sort of minor god or something. Because hubris is a thing that can kill you. No question about it.
Pride.
Pride.
Yeah. People are out there wondering if I'm ever going to have the guts to mention the name Elizabeth Taylor in your presence. And I don't know that I am. But partly because your more than lovely wife was backstage. But I would like to know one thing, and this interests me and may be far too technical for people's tastes, but she is said to have a genius for screen acting. And I had seen references of your having learned from her. Or her.
Oh, yes. I think she's I know she'll forgive me for saying so, but she is indeed a woman of infinite variety. But I've talked about her so much in the last 20 years, perhaps, that even she is getting tired of what I say about her. Anyway, I like her very much, and she likes me, and I think she's one of the most underrated screen actresses that ever lived, and I think she's one of the best ones who ever lived. At her very finest, she is incomparable.
Among actors, she's highly thought of, but...
for the press, I think, are deceived by her great beauty, and they can't believe that somebody as pretty or as beautiful as that can actually act as well.
Sure.
But there's no question about it that she is a superb screen actress. And I think that in later years, I mean, can you remember Bogart ever having a good notice during his lifetime, except for, shall we say, The African Queen or something like that, where he played something outside himself, slightly outside himself. Yeah. I think that Elizabeth will become a cult figure one of these days, and that her films will be run endlessly on television, as bogies are now. And people will realize that perhaps she was before her time as an actress. And if you don't mind, I won't say anything more about Elizabeth Taylor.
That's quite all right with me. I didn't want to mention it when you had your shoes off, because then you couldn't leave if you wanted to. Somebody ought to do a book of the bad reviews that the greatest people we know have gotten. I'm amazed whenever doing research of the pans that Olivier has gotten, and Gielgud and people like that. Olivier claims to, Gielgud claims to like them. I mean, he says, I find them more interesting, and I never can get my other fellow actors to talk about them. They don't seem to find them as interesting. And they say you don't learn anything from praise. But I just wonder if there's any particular film of yours that you would like to have cut up into collar stays that you made.
Most of them, I should think.
Most of them?
Yes. No, I should think there are about 10 or a dozen that are watchable. Not by me, but by other people. I won't watch myself unless I can possibly avoid it. Sometimes I've had to go to Royal Command performances and so on, where I've been forced to sit there. I try to bury my head in my hands, but it's very difficult if the Queen is looking straight at you.
Doing what you and Bogart did to that man. I guess there isn't just any one film that you hope, if it's ever on the Late Show, you have the set removed from the...
No, well, there are many. You know, somebody came, a publicity man, one of those chaps who knows everything about films, and he came up to me about 2 or 3 years ago and said, "Congratulations." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "This is your 60th film." I said, "My God, I didn't think I'd made as many films as that." So, because I'd done so much stage as well. So I went back to the dressing room, and my makeup man and a great friend of mine who's been with me for years, we sat down, we wrote down the names of the films, and we'd forgotten 14 of them. It's an indication of the quality of the film.
Forget an entire movie, let alone 14 of them, must be.
It wasn't just I had forgotten, they'd forgotten.
They had too. I promise you this won't go on forever, but there are just one or two things I need to know from you before we end, which may necessitate your being here tomorrow night. Only one person? Anyway, we'll keep our fingers crossed and try to see you then, because I haven't said goodbye properly, and I can't tonight, so I'll have to do it tomorrow. Did I get away with that? Welcome to, I've lost count, but still another part of a continuing conversation with Richard Burton, which has proved that he's as interesting off stage as he is on. And if you will simply welcome him again, I won't waste any more time telling you who he is. I learned that one thing one doesn't do with you is to offer you a massage. When your arm was bothering you, I know a masseur, and I was going to send him over as a little gift, but you don't like to be rubbed and
or touched
or touched.
Anyway, yes, I find it. It's been one of the things that's quite difficult in acting, is that I don't like to be touched by other actors or actresses or whatever, unless it's absolutely essential to the scene.
Would you?
I shrink immediately. Really? I don't know why.
Bite a bullet during love scenes and.
Well, I think that's my great weakness as an actor. I'm not very good at love scenes, though God knows I've done enough of them. And some very perceptive critics have picked that up. Ken Tynan, in particular, never stops saying that I can't make love on the screen, and he's probably right.
Confined himself to that, did he?
Yes. No, he once gave me a notice, Ken Tynan. I'm rather fond of Ken Tynan, because his notices are, though barbed, they're witty. Yeah. And I was playing Ferdinand in The Tempest, and I really didn't want to play it. And I begged the producers, to let me out of it. I said, I'd be one of the dancers, anything. I said, please don't make me play Ferdinand. It's an unplayable part. And anyway, they said, no, it's in the contract. You have to do it. So I played it. And the critics were quite nice about it, quite friendly, except for Tynan, who said, I'm pretty sure it was Tynan. I must ask him, because it's such a long time ago. Whoever it was, anyway, said, as for Mr. Richard Burton as Ferdinand, this is the first time we've ever seen the part played by a bull.
And you took that as negative, did you? That's for their actors who would like to be called a bull on the stage. But.
Yes.
And it's funny that you were considered too effeminate at one point in your career. I really found that very hard, because of that story you told about... well, that is exactly how he put it. But what was it? Too light, too pretty, too
pretty. Yes.
Too something or other.
Too pretty.
What did you sound like in the early days when Philip Burton, the man you mentioned, very important in your life, had to correct the way you spoke so that you were acceptable on stage?
Well,
that's how it's
in
been
English
put.
parts, you mean? Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I spoke with a Welsh accent, and so what did it sound like? I don't know. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether it is nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of trouble and by proposing end them. I sounded a bit like that.
I rather like that, but then some people find German unpleasant sounding, and I think it's quite beautiful.
I think it's beautiful.
How would it sound in German?
Sein oder nicht sein, das ist die Frage. Ob's edler in der Mut die Pfeil und Schleudern. Beautiful.
Japanese? Do I look impressed? I certainly am, if I don't. Would you talk about booze for a moment?
If you like.
As a kind of maybe public service or whatever?
I think I've done enough public service in that direction. However, if it helps anybody, yes.
Well, it might very well. I guess what I want to know is how do you know when you're in trouble with your...
I think that nobody quite knows which drink it is that takes him over the edge of being merely a social or hearty, laughing drinker into a morose and hungover, wretched creature who shakes and creaks and sweats and has nightmares, and it's always November and it's raining and it's 3 o'clock in the morning and there's nowhere to go, and you reach out for a cigarette and smoke and think of all the horrible things you've done in your life and all the shames you've endured and suffered, and the shame you gave other people, and all the wrongs you've done other people. I don't know whether alcoholics can put it quite as eloquently as that. Usually they just say, I just stared out of a window for 2 years. And it is, believe me, the question of being an alcoholic. I'm not quite sure that I am one, but if I'm not one, I'm very near. I'm very right on the edge of being one. But it is no laughing matter. It really is not a laughing matter. Alcoholism is a dreadful disease. And my sympathy for, I believe there are something like 15 million Americans alone who are alcoholics, and my sympathy for them and my affection for them is profound. They come up to me, you know, as being a representative figure of this dreadful disease, and one of the things they love to do is to tell stories about what they got up to when they were drunk, and I listen and I laugh, and they genuinely found me some of the stories. But it is a tragic disease and a dreadful one, and I think, well, no, I can't say that I've beaten it, because as Jimmy Breslin, who was a dear friend of mine, wrote me a short but very eloquent letter once, some years ago, when I was in trouble with drink, and he said, don't forget the drink. And he used the analogy of a boxing match, and that you're always fighting. You're always fighting. And the other fella is booze. And you evade him. You evade him. But one of these days, unless you're careful, he's going to nail you right on the chin. And down you go. So it's a continual fight. Every day it's a fight. And when you get through the day and you finally put your head on the pillow and you sleep, you say, I've beaten that boxer for yet another day.
Another day.
And so for the rest of your life, you're stuck with that shadowy figure, always, always coming at you, always coming at you. And there is every conceivable excuse. Take a drink. I got a bad note, so I take a drink. I got a good note, so I take a drink. As to one would, if you didn't have my particular self-control and, of course, the enormous assistance of my wife.
Yeah.
Without Susan, I think, without any exaggeration whatsoever, I might very easily be dead. I'm not joking, I mean that.
Yeah.
When I played Equus in New York 4 years ago, it was the first time in my life I'd ever been on the stage without a drink. And I shook and I shivered, and she knew, Susan knew, and I had, as you know, an enormous success in that. And the audiences were fantastically kind, and they gave me standing ovations and all that, but every night we never knew if I'd crack. And never once, for instance, did she hide the booze or anything like that. There was a bottle of vodka and there was a bottle of gin right in the dressing room. All I had to do was open the door and there it was. Yeah. And it was, I was in it for 12 weeks. And one performance which Tony Perkins very kindly gave me on a Saturday matinee to sort of run me in before anybody knew I was going to be in it, that I was opening. So we counted the performances. It's the only time. I don't count them in Camelot because I'm over that, over that hurdle. But he's still there. That fellow's still there. And all I can say is to anybody in this country or in the world who has the same problem, you have my deepest sympathies, and I hope you have a wife like mine. That's all.
Should hang on to that. It was certainly heartwarming, wasn't it, when you missed a performance the other night from illness, of how certain
well, the press insisted that I was
papers
drunk, which I wasn't.
Yeah, everybody was willing, blazing them.
That was a combination of drugs that I simply, I became deathly ill with cortisone and something else. However, the next night I was a little apprehensive, to put it mildly, to go on the stage, and I was taken home and put to bed by Susan, and then I woke about 3 in the morning when this inside I'd been vomiting and going back and forth to the lavatory all night, and I said, now tell me what happened, because it was the ultimate in actors' nightmares. It happened to me once before when I was playing Hamlet here on Broadway, and I lifted up my arm when I screamed in the middle of "Oh, what a rogue and peasant slave am I," and I couldn't get my arm down again. And my makeup ran right off my face, as it did the other night, ran right off my face onto my costume. And I couldn't move and I couldn't speak. And so they had to bring the curtain down and give the money back to the audience. So the next night I went on and I thought, how influenced are people by the press? Because though I hadn't read it, I was told that the press were exulting in the fact that I'd failed on the Thursday night. And so when I came through when I made the entrance, which you've seen, which is fairly dramatic anyway, I was absolutely breathless. I wasn't quite sure what was going to happen. And I stepped out, and there was a most tremendous ovation. The stage manager tells me it went on for something like 3.5 minutes.
That's a lifetime.
On the stage, it's a lifetime. And I just stood there, and I could feel the audience supporting me, and the affection and the warmth is one of the most extraordinary experiences I've ever had in the theatre. And I may say that the American public are generally enormously generous, much more so than, shall we say, the French, who believe that unless you're French, you might as well be dead.
That's a wonderful definition.
And they are enormously generous, but they certainly were that night. And so I gave a performance that was possibly the best I've given yet. It was on such a very high level. They made me turn it up several notches, so that the entire evening flew on wings, and the end was stupendous. And boy, was that a good feeling to be accepted back.
So the actor can be moved by the audience as well as the other way around.
Oh yes, I think the audience and the actor must become one person, one animal, one thinking creature, that they respond to everything you do because they make you do it. A bad house, to try and get a bad house to react in the right way is very, very hard work. But a good house, you can almost coast on them like surfing on a great wave. Yeah.
I wish I'd seen that performance. The one I saw was most impressive, and the thing that was mysterious about it, as I thought about it later, was that you didn't seem to do very much. By that I mean if you saw a silent film of it, there was not, partly I know you were limited by bursitis, but it seemed to be more than that, and at probably the definition of an economical performance, and yet at the end of the first act there were wet eyes all around, and how you got so much emotional contact with the audience in seeming to do so not a flamboyant performance, I guess physically is what I'm trying to say.
Well, one of the few axioms I work by as an actor is to get the greatest possible effect with the minimum possible visible effort.
That would seem to be a rule for film, but to be able to do it on the stage.
Yes, I think that that stage acting and screen acting can be very, very, very alike, except, of course, that the microphone on film cannot take the size of the voice when it really screams or something like that, because you smash the mic. Yeah. So you're limited in that way in films. But on the stage, of course, there's no limit. You can scream to the high heavens, and the better you can scream, the better they react. But to scream from total immobility, when you're standing absolutely still, not a movement, and to pick up your voice and throw it without the body moving at all, is perhaps the ultimate in what I was saying, that you get the maximum effect with a minimum possible visible effort. Of course, the effort is tremendous, but it's hidden.
Yeah.
It's, what?
I'm sorry, I interrupted you. I was wondering if you could do that in a role that demands great swordplay and so on. You have to.
Well, for instance, in Hamlet, which I played here in New York, and I played at the Old Vic in London. Actually, it's the longest run of anything I've ever been in. Of one single play that I've ever been in was the Hamlet I did here, because I always had an out, or I played in repertory where you played 5 or 6 different plays a week. But Hamlet was the longest run of just one part every night. And in that, of course, I moved all the time.
Sure.
I mean, except for certain specified, unwritten bits that you simply stood absolutely still. But for the most part, I moved almost like I played him as a manic depressive. And I moved around the stage all the time, never stopped moving. So it meant I lost a lot of weight. And also, of course, the fight is very,
It's a
very
wonderful,
active.
it's a wonderful gift. I just remember we're halfway through this show. We didn't finish that story.
Which
That
story?
we started the other night. I hope people at home realize that we tape these all in one sitting, more or less, but they seem to be on different nights.
Can I have a sip
And
of
it
this?
was the... Where did we end up? And it was a word you
This
were trying to think of.
Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola. His. Unless he's laced it with something, I hope not.
Be careful. I wouldn't let that happen. What was the story we were... I just remember this sense, like a dream, that we didn't finish a story.
There was a time story.
Oh, yes, yes.
Yeah.
A
Yes,
word...
Mr. Rich, his name is, of the Times, right?
Mr. Frank Rich.
Mr. Frank Rich. Right. So I heard 2 or 3 lines, 4 lines. And Mr. Rich was very handsome in his tributes to me as an actor. But unfortunately for me, he picked out one word that I said. I will not repeat the word here, because I don't want any audiences to be as conscious of it as I am now.
It's like a jinx now when you get to that word.
So when I get to that word now, I'm so conscious of the fact that Mr. Rich said that I seem to use a whole octave of my voice just to say that one word, that now I can't say it at all.
It's the one word in the language you
I
can't...
call it sort of go clunk when I come to it. So it'll take me some time to forget that Mr. Rich was so glowing in his tribute to my acting and so on. So that's what I meant about when they're good, you know, they can hurt you as well as when they're bad. Now, it didn't hurt me, naturally. I was delighted that he thought I was very good. But
it works like
that one word now, I'm so conscious of it that I kind of slough it off a bit. But it'll come back until I'll forget it one of these days.
It is almost like upsmanship, isn't it? It's like, watch this great golf swing. Go ahead. You know, and the person then can't hold the club.
I remember Gladys Cooper, the famous old English actress, saying that she made a return to the British theatre after being absent for many years, and the dean of the British critics in those days was a man called Harold Hobson, and he wrote a notice of glowing tribute to her return to the theatre and so on. And he said, and who will ever forget, something like this, who will ever forget the way Miss Cooper says, A-H, when she hears the news of her son's death or something like that. She said she could never say it again.
Of course not.
Couldn't do it.
What can you do? Can you change the word? You can't very well.
Oh, really, you could say.
Yeah, really?
He's dead, isn't he? Then we should have to bury him.
I don't believe it, and then the whole play would be out of it. Is it bad taste to ask you to pity all those people in cities that Camelot won't tour in, and to therefore perhaps give them just a hint of the performance
Well,
here and now?
well, if they want to hear me sing, they can buy the record, which will increase my earning.
Oh, yes.
So I won't sing, but I think what is perhaps indicative of the whole show, and indeed you mentioned the fact, the immobility, and Alan J. Lerner has written a little speech, very simple, almost childlike in its simplicity, in which the king, King Arthur, explains to Guinevere how he became king. And because she's already done a long scene with him, and he's sung her a song asking her to stay in Camelot and all that. And now suddenly she's discovered by the courtiers, and they bow to me, and she suddenly realizes that I'm the king, and I haven't told her that I am. And so they all leave the stage, and I'm left alone with Christine Ebersole, who plays Guinevere. And I can't look her in the eye. So I played more or less straight out front to the audience with occasional look at Christine. And when it works, it goes like this. When I was a lad of 18, Our dear King Pendragon died in London and left no one to succeed him. Only a sword stuck through a stone which stood on an anvil. Written on it in letters of gold, it said, "Whoso pulleth this sword of this stone and anvil shall be rightwise king born of all England." Many men tried to dislodge it, but none could. Finally, a great tournament was proclaimed for New Year's Day so that all the mightiest knights in England could be assembled at one time to have an attempt at the sword. I went to London as squire to my cousin, Sir Kay. The morning of the tournament, Kay discovered he'd left his sword at home and gave me a shilling to ride back and fetch it. On my way through London, I passed a square and saw there this sword rising from a stone. Not thinking very quickly, I thought it was a war memorial. The square was deserted. I decided to save myself a journey and borrow it. I tried to pull it out. I failed. I tried again. I failed again. Then I closed my eyes and with all my strength tried one last time. And lo, it moved in my hand. And slowly it slid from the stone. I heard a great roar. When I opened my eyes, the square was filled with people shouting, "Long live the king! Long live the king!" I looked at the sword and saw the blade gleaming with letters of gold. That's how I became king.
Certainly gave us our money's worth. That was wonderful.
Well, you see, we couldn't do it unless the speech was so simply and beautifully written. And then you simply speak it and try to feel it and see that sword. And with a good audience, it's electrifying. You can feel them, as indeed you were. May I say, a very good audience for that. But it's quite a long speech. Thank you very much for listening so carefully.
At the end, I thought you were talking to me when the line was still part of the speech, and I could get Well, I was going to do trees, but I guess
It's not fair to the shade of Kilmer.
No, I think I'll wait a day or so and some other show. I don't suppose it would be possible for you to go home in the Thomas Wolfe sense if you decided to chuck it all for any reason. And do you ever have an image of that possibly having had enough and trying to go back and live in Wales or on an island somewhere, or to do without acting?
I think it's the actor's or the successful actor's dream that he wants to be a farmer or something, or he wants to make 2 blades of grass grow unmistakably or whatever it is, where one grew before, and all that. But I'm afraid that I only know of one important major actor who said, "I'm going to quit when I'm 50," and actually did quit and never went back.
Who was that?
He was an English actor called Sir Johnston Forbes Robertson. And he was supposed to be one of the finest Hamlets of his time. And he took off his makeup on his 50th birthday and said, "That's it," and went to his house in Hampstead and never appeared again, and he lived until he was 80.
Happily, do we assume? Or?
We don't know.
We don't know.
But that's the only major actor I've ever heard of who actually stopped.
You'll realize why I saved this for the end.
What are you up to?
What went on between... Oh, I can't do it.
Oh, what went on between...
What went on between you and my wife in Munich?
Carrie. Carrie.
You remember.
Yes, I do. I remember with great affection.
Well, I felt like President Carter and Billy. I've been keeping this a secret from you.
No, she was very sweet, I thought. And we had to act together and apart sometimes under very difficult conditions because the script was negligible. Yes. And the direction was actually, I don't think the fellow was there, but anyway. And the technical side was impossible, and so the whole thing was a mess. And so it seemed to me that your wife was absolutely splendid about it all, and I give her my warmest affection.
Okay, if
nothing else went on. I think we had a few drinks together now and again.
Yeah.
Mostly now.
Yeah. Then I can't believe the version I found in her diary. Is that what you're saying? Well, all right. Well, don't decide to quit when you're 50, if you are, in fact, not that.
I'm already 50.
Oh, well, and, second time.
I'm in my early 50s, as we euphemistically say, meaning that I'd be 60 next birthday. No, that's not true. I'm actually 53.
The time has fled again. I hate to be... I could go on, and I just thank you for being so generous about yourself.
Thank you.
It's been wonderful.
Thank you for being so.
Richard Burton.
Funding for the Dick Cavett Show has been provided by this station and other public television stations, and by a grant from the Chubb Group of insurance companies.
And yet, you know, there were guests who... My great shows, if I say so myself, with Richard Burton.
The Richard Burton story is a great story. But we're out of time, so can we ask you, will you stick around and do sort of Dick Cavett Part 2? Now, Dick, when we ended last time we were talking to you, we were just getting to Richard Burton, one of the all-time great guests.
Oh, yeah. I forget how Burton happened to come up, but...
The drink card.
Yeah.
We'd been talking... Oh, yes, we'd been talking about how essential to a British chat show was the drinks trolley in the green room. And I had guests come on reeling in England, but it also produces some very interesting and sometimes otherwise unobtainable words and phrases out of people and information, which they later awaken and find themselves in the papers having said and weren't aware of it. I had Sir Lloyd George, was he, of the time, was United, phenomenally British politician known for being a drunk. I think that's the polite term for what he was. One time he was just abused for having voted for something the wrong way. And he said, "You can't blame me, I was drunk at the time." Can you imagine getting away with that in America?
Now, was Burton drunk, though, when he did the show with you?
No, that's a good point. Burton was... And I say this having read that wonderful biography that deserves much more acclaim than I've seen, with not a very good title. I think it's called Ferocious Love. But it's the book about Burton and Taylor. And Miss Maureen Dowd turned me on to it, having watched my Burton shows on my column. They were the videos of the 4 half hours. Were there. And the book tells you how to find them. But he was not drinking. And when he was, it might not have been that noticeable. But the quantities that he drank, it's a miracle he made it into his, you know how many decades
50s,
he lived?
I think, yeah.
In his 50s. But he was scintillating, wonderful, hypnotic.
Were you intimidated by him at all? Did you
Not
know
in the
him?
least. The instant I... I knew him only because 2 weeks earlier I had gone summoned to come back to his dressing room in Camelot, the revival, and see him and see how he liked me or whatever, I guess. And we got on him right away. He immediately put a long Marlboro in his mouth and said, these are going to be with me to the end of my days, I'm afraid. And then they weren't only what killed him, but then he chatted with me, and then we left, crossed the darkened stage that I had just seen Camelot in. And you know the ghost light in theater terms, the dim sort of bulb on a pole, was all there was in the entire theater. And he stopped next to it, and he looked at some imaginary friend, I guess, or something in the balcony, and began, "Oh, for a muse of fire that would ascend the brightest heavens of invention," and did the Henry V prologue. For me.
For you.
And maybe a press agent who was the one. Talk about front row seats. I just got goose flashing out thinking about it. But then he came on. He didn't want an audience. I was very sorry.
And you usually had an audience?
On the PBS show I did, yeah. And I said to him, I'll tell you what, risky, I think, why don't we have one there? If it's in any way bothersome, we'll tell them that because of a sound problem, we're going to have to ask them to leave and invite them back to another show or something. So he said, well, all right. And he was there for a half hour. And when it started, right away he got a laugh. And every muscle in his face seemed to relax.
I very rarely watch talk shows, but when I do, I'm very conscious of people's shoes, because they always cross their legs like this. Oh, let's try that.
That's right. It seems to be a rule.
And the shoes are always in front of the people. And I become so fascinated by the shoes, and I forget to look at the faces. So I thought I'd try with my socks.
That's right.
But maybe they're attracting more attention now, do you think, than...
I don't know. I like the idea that talk shows
I'll do that.
have become...
And he had the best time, and so I asked him if he'd come back right then, technically. So we did a second night's show then, and then a third night's show then, and then a fourth night's show then. And whenever I look at them, I think, why did I lose the guts to say, we got to do a fifth one? Because he talked away another show in the green room afterwards.
Have the week.
Of course.
They have the week.
Now, he was very sick. Didn't realize, so he had a very bad operation right after that. He was praised in Camelot for his economy of motion. And on one of these shows, he talked about one of his goals as an actor was to do the least and convey the most in that least. Line reading, physically, whatever. That was interesting. Yeah. I don't know. He may not even realize at that moment that it applied to his slow movements in Camelot, which were forced on him by a terrible thing back there. He had a laminectomy.
What's that?
And I asked, that's what I said to a doctor. And he said, well, it's probably best described as we go in through your throat and take out part of your back. So he had this awful operation. And I only learned recently that it was not a success, and that he suffered a lot from it. He also was hemophiliac and diabetic, things nobody knew.
Oh, my God. Oh, that was the
I'm
alcohol.
sorry, epileptic. He
Oh,
was
my God.
epileptic and diabetic.
He looks on the show, the famous show you did with him, though, he looks as though he looks a little worn down by life. And
Absolutely, that was a lived-in face.
Yeah, he just looks tired.
The face looked not ravaged, but damaged.
Yeah.
I remember Peter O'Toole once, I did a show with him, saying that, I said, can you guys really drink all night and show up and work? And he said, not as a rule, it wasn't a good idea. But they did often. These legendary drunks like Burton and